Hello, this is Emmy speaking, and I will be reading the first chapter of Nightmare Tales. Chapter 1, The Stranger's Story. My birthplace is a small mountain hamlet, a cluster of Swiss cottages hidden deep in a sunny nook between two tumble-down glaciers and a peak covered with eternal snows. Thither 37 years ago I returned, crippled mentally and physically, to die if death would only have me. The pure, invigorating air of my birthplace decided otherwise. I am still alive, perhaps for the purpose of giving evidence to facts I have kept profoundly secret from all, a tale of horror I would rather hide than reveal. The reason for this unwillingness on my part is due to my early education and to subsequent events that gave the lie to my most cherished prejudices. Some people might be inclined to regard these events as providential. I, however, believe in no providence, and yet am unable to attribute them to mere chance. I connect them as the ceaseless evolution of effects engendered by certain direct causes, with one primary and fundamental cause from which ensued all that followed. A feeble old man am I now, yet physical weakness has in no way impaired my mental faculties. I remember the smallest details of that terrible cause, which engendered some fatal results. It is these which furnish me with an additional proof of the actual existence of one whom I fain would regard. Oh, that I could do so! As a creature born of my fancy, the evanescent production of a feverish, horrid dream. Oh, that terrible, mild, and all-forgiving, that saintly and respected being. It was that paragon of all the virtues who embittered my whole existence. It is he who, pushing me violently out of the monotonous but secure groove of daily life, was the first to force upon me the certitude of a life hereafter, thus adding an additional horror to one already great enough. With a view to a clearer comprehension of the situation, I must interrupt these recollections with a few words about myself. Oh, how, if I could, would I obliterate that hated self. Born in Switzerland of French parents who centered the whole world wisdom in the literary trinity of Voltaire, J.J. Rousseau, and de Holbach, and educated in a German university, I grew up a thorough materialist, a confirmed atheist. I could never have even pictured to myself any beings, least of all a being, above or even outside visible nature, as distinguished from her. Hence I regarded everything that could not be brought under the strictest analysis of the physical senses as a mere chimera. A soul, I argued, even supposing man has one, must be material. According to Origen's definition, incorporeus, the epithet he gave to his god signifies a substance only more subtle than that of physical bodies, of which, at best, we can form no definite idea. How, then, can that of which our senses cannot enable us to obtain any clear knowledge, how can that make itself visible, or produce any tangible manifestations? Accordingly, I received the tales of nascent spiritualism with a feeling of utter contempt, and regarded the overtures made by certain priests with derision, often akin to anger. And indeed, the latter feeling has never entirely abandoned me. Pascal, in the 8th act of his Thoughts, confesses to a most complete incertitude upon the existence of God. Throughout my life I too professed a complete certitude as to the non-existence of any such extra-cosmic being, and repeated, with that great thinker, the memorable words in which he tells us, I have examined if this God of whom all the world speaks might not have left some marks of himself. I look everywhere, and everywhere I see nothing but obscurity. Nature offers me nothing that may not be a matter of doubt and inquietude. Nor have I found to this day anything that might unsettle me in precisely similar and even stronger feelings. I have never believed, nor shall I ever believe, in a supreme being, But at the potentialities of man proclaimed far and wide in the East, power is so developed in some persons as to make them virtually gods, at them I laugh no more. My whole broken life is a protest against such negation. I believe in such phenomena, and I curse them whenever they come, and by whatsoever means generated. On the death of my parents, owing to an unfortunate lawsuit, I lost the greater part of my fortune, and resolved, for the sake of those I loved best, rather than for my own, to make another for myself. My elder sister, whom I adored, had married a poor man. I accepted the offer of a rich Hamburg firm, and sailed for Japan as its junior partner. For several years my business went on successfully. I got into the confidence of many influential Japanese, through whose protection I was enabled to travel and transact business on many localities which, in those days especially, were not easily accessible to foreigners. Indifferent to every religion, I became interested in the philosophy of Buddhism, the only religious system I thought worthy of being called philosophical. Thus, in my moments of leisure, I visited the most remarkable temples of Japan, the most important and curious of the 96 Buddhist monasteries of Kyoto. I have examined, in turn, Daibuotsu, with its gigantic bell, Seonene, Enarino Yasario, Kimiso, Higatsihongwansi, and many other famous temples. Several years passed away, and during that whole period I was not cured of my skepticism, nor did I ever contemplate having my opinions on this subject altered. I derided the pretensions of that Japanese bonzes and ascetics, as I had those of Christian priests and European spiritualists. I could not believe in the acquisition of powers unknown to, and never studied by, men of science. Hence I scoffed at all such ideas. The superstitious and atrabilious Buddhist, teaching us to shun the pleasures of life, to put to root one's passions, to render oneself insensible alike to happiness and suffering, in order to acquire such chimerical powers, seemed supremely ridiculous in my eyes. On a day forever memorable to me, a fatal day, I made the acquaintance of a venerable and learned bonze, a Japanese priest, named Tamura Hideyori. I met him at the foot of the Golden Kwanon, and from that moment he became my best and most trusted friend. Notwithstanding my great and genuine regard for him, however, whenever a good opportunity was offered, I never failed to mock his religious convictions, thereby very often hurting his feelings. But my old friend was as meek and forgiving as any true Buddhist's heart might desire. He never resented my impatient sarcasms, even when they were, to say the least, of equivocal propriety, and generally limited his replies to wait-and-see kind of protest. Nor could he be brought to seriously believe in the sincerity of my denial of the existence of any god or gods. The full meaning of the terms atheism and skepticism was beyond the comprehension of his otherwise extremely intellectual and acute mind. Like certain reverential Christians, he seemed incapable of realizing that any man of sense should prefer the wise conclusions arrived at by philosophy and modern science to a ridiculous belief in an invisible world full of gods and spirits, denizens, and demons. Man is a spiritual being, he insisted, who returns to earth more than once, and is rewarded or punished in the between times. The proposition that man is nothing else but a heap of organized dust was beyond him. Like Jeremy Collier, he refused to admit that he was no better than a stalking machine, a speaking head without a soul in it, whose thoughts are all bound by the laws of motion. For, he argued, if my actions were, as you say, prescribed beforehand, and I had no liberty or free will to change the course of my action, then the running waters of the river yonder, then the glorious doctrine of karma, of merit and demerit, would be foolishness indeed. Thus the whole of my hyper-metaphysical friend's ontology rested on the shaky superstructure of metempsychosis, of a fancied just law of retribution, and other such equally absurd dreams. "We cannot," said he paradoxically one day, "hope to live hereafter in the full enjoyment of our consciousness, unless we have built for it beforehand a firm and solid foundation of spirituality. Nay, laugh not, friend of no faith," he meekly pleaded, "but rather think and reflect on this. One who has never taught himself to live in spirit during his conscious and responsible life on earth can hardly hope to enjoy a sentient existence after death. When derived of his body, he is limited to that spirit alone." "What can you mean by life in spirit?" I inquired. "Life on a spiritual plane, that which the Buddhists call Tushita Davaloka, paradise. Man can create such a blissful existence for himself between two births, by the gradual transference onto that plane of all the faculties which during his sojourn on earth manifest through his organic body, and, as you call it, animal brain." "How absurd! And how can man do this?" "Contemplation and a strong desire to assimilate the blessed gods will enable him to do so. And if man refuses this intellectual occupation, by which you mean, I suppose, the fixing of the eyes on the tip of his nose, and what becomes of him after the death of his body?" was my mocking question. "He will be dealt with according to the prevailing state of his consciousness, of which there are many grades, at best intimate rebirth, at worst the state of avicii, a mental hell. Yet one need not be an ascetic to assimilate spiritual life, which will extend to the hereafter. All that is required is to try to approach spirit." "How so, even when disbelieving in it?" I rejoined. "Even so. One may disbelieve and yet harbor in one's nature room for doubt, however small that room may be, and thus try one day, were it but for one moment, to open the door of the inner temple, and this will prove sufficient toward the purpose." "You are decidedly poetical and paradoxical to boot, reverend sir. Will you kindly explain to me a little more of the mystery?" "There is none. Still I am willing. Suppose for a moment that some unknown temple to which you have never been before, and the existence of which you think you have reasons to deny, is the spiritual plane of which I am speaking. Some one takes you by the hand and leads you toward its entrance. Curiosity makes you open its door and look inside and look within. By this simple act, by entering it for 1 second, you have established an everlasting connection between your consciousness and the temple. You cannot deny its existence any longer, nor obliterate the fact of your having entered it. And according to the character and the variety of your work within its holy precincts, so will you live in it, after your consciousness is severed from its dwelling of flesh." "What do you mean, and what has my after-death consciousness, if such a thing exists, to do with the temple?" "It has everything to do with it," solemnly rejoined the old man. "There can be no self-consciousness after death outside the temple of spirit. That which you will have done within its plane will alone survive. All the rest is false and an illusion. It is doomed to perish in the ocean of Maya." Amused at the idea of living outside one's body, I urged on my old friend to tell me more. Mistaking my meaning, the venerable man willingly consented. Tamura Hide Yori belonged to the great temple of Ji-Onene, a Buddhist monastery, famous not only in all Japan but also throughout Tibet and China. No other is so venerated in Kyoto. Its monks belong to the sect of Zen-no-do and are considered as the most learned among the many erudite fraternities. They are, moreover, closely connected and allied with the Yamabushi, the ascetics, or hermits, who followed the doctrines of Lao Tzu. No wonder that at the slightest provocation on my part, the priest flew into the highest metaphysics, hoping thereby to cure me of my infidelity. No use repeating here the long rigmarole of the most hopelessly involved and incomprehensible of all doctrines. According to his ideas, we have to train ourselves for spirituality in another world as for gymnastics. Carrying on the analogy between the temple and the spiritual plane, he tried to illustrate his idea. He had himself worked in the temple of spirit 2/3 of his life, and given several hours daily to contemplation. Thus he knew that after he had laid aside his moral casket, a mere illusion, he explained, he would, in his spiritual consciousness, live over again every feeling of ennobling joy and divine bliss he had ever had, or ought to have had, only 100-fold intensified. His work on the spiritual plane had been considerable, he said, and he hoped, therefore, that the wages of the laborer would prove proportionate. But suppose the laborer, as in the example you have just brought forward in my case, should have no more than opened the temple door out of mere curiosity, had only peeped into the sanctuary ever to set his foot therein again, what then? Then, he answered, you would have only this short minute to record in your future self-consciousness and no more. Our life hereafter records and repeats but the impressions and feelings we have had in our spiritual experiences and nothing else. Thus, if instead of reverence, in the moment of entering the abode of spirit, you had been harboring in your heart anger, jealousy, or grief, then your future spiritual life would be a sad one in truth. There would be nothing to record, save the opening of a door in a fit of bad temper. How then could it be repeated? I insisted, highly amused. What do you suppose I would be doing before incarnating again? In that case, he said, speaking slowly and weighing every word, in that case, you would have, I fear, only to open and shut the temple door over and over again, during a period which, however short, would seem to you an eternity. This kind of after-death occupation appeared to me at that time so grotesque in its sublime absurdity that I was seized with an almost inextinguishable fit of laughter. My venerable friend looked considerably dismayed at such a result of his metaphysical instruction. He had evidently not expected such hilarity. However, he said nothing, but only sighed and gazed at me with increased benevolence and pity shining in his small black eyes. "Pray excuse my laughter," I apologized. "But really, now, you cannot seriously mean to tell me that the spiritual state you advocate and so firmly believe in consists only in aping certain things we do in life?" Nay, not aping, but only intensifying their repetition, filling the gaps that were unjustly left unfilled during life in the fruition of our acts and deeds, and of everything performed on the spiritual plane of the one real state. What I said was an illustration, and no doubt for you, who seem entirely ignorant of the mysteries of soul vision, not a very intelligible one. It is myself who am to be blamed. What I ought to impress upon you was that, as the spiritual state of our consciousness liberated from its body is but the fruition of every spiritual act performed during life, where an act had been barren, there could be no results expected, save the repetition of the act itself. That is all. I pray you may be spared such fruitless deeds, and finally made to see certain truths. And passing through the usual Japanese courtesies of taking leave, the excellent man departed. Alas, had I but known at the time what I have learned since, how little would I have laughed, and how much more would I have learned. But as the matter stood, the more personal affection and respect I felt for him, the less could I become reconciled to his wild ideas about afterlife. especially as to the acquisition by some men of supernatural powers. I felt particularly disgusted with his reverence for the Yamabushi, the allies of every Buddhist sect in the land. Their claims to the miraculous were simply odious to my notions. To hear every Japanese I knew at Kyoto, even to my own partner, the shrewdest of all the business men I had come across in the East, mentioning these followers of Lao Tzu with downcast eyes, reverentially folded hands, and affirmations of their possessing great and wonderful gifts, was more than I was prepared to patiently tolerate in those days. And who were they, after all, these great magicians of their ridiculous pretensions to super-mundane knowledge, these holy beggars who, as I then thought, purposely dwell in the recesses of unfrequented mountains and on unapproachable craggy steeps, so as the better to afford no chance to curious intruders of finding them out and watching them in their own dens. Simply impudent fortune-tellers, Japanese gypsies who sell charms and talismans, and no better. In answer to those who sought to assure me that though the Yamabushi lead a mysterious life, admitting none of the profane to their secrets, they still do accept pupils, however difficult it is for one to become their disciple, and that thus they have living witnesses to the great purity and sanctity of their lives. In answer to such affirmations, I opposed the strongest negation and stood firmly by it. I insulted both masters and pupils, classing them under the same category of fools, when not knaves, and I went so far as to include in this number the Shintos. Now Shintoism, or Shinshu, faith in the gods, in the way to the gods, that is, belief in the communication between these creatures and men, is a kind of worship of nature spirits, than which nothing can be more miserably absurd. And by placing the Shintos among the fools and knaves of other sects, I gained many enemies. For the Shinto Kanushi, spiritual teachers, are looked upon as the highest in the upper classes of society, the Mikado himself being at the head of their hierarchy, and the members of the sect belonging to the most cultured and educated men in Japan. These Kanushi of the Shinto form no caste or class apart, nor do they pass any ordination, at any rate none known to outsiders. And as they claim publicly no special privilege or powers, even their dress being in no wise different from that of the laity, but are simply, in the world's opinion, professors and students of occult and spiritual sciences, I very often came in contact with them without in the least suspecting that I was in the presence of such personages. And that was the end of chapter 1. If you liked it, please comment, like, subscribe, and press that notification bell if you would like to. And have a great day. I hope you enjoyed.